we didn't get the one, and they got a late fee. So the next bill had a price amount, so they paid that. Now yeah, that's why I didn't like the bus.
Brother Jeff, would you open with a word of prayer, please?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. Thank you for being able to be here today, study a portion of your word, and that's what you do for Brother Bob as he brings the word to us. Keep each and every one of us as we prepare our hearts and minds to study your word. Be with those that are teaching here and in the country and in the world, we ask that you'll watch over them and be with them today as they will worship and study your word. We ask that you be with those that are sick, congregation and around us, and ask that you watch over them and help them get better. I ask that you'll be with us now as we go through the study and we see through us in Jesus' name.
Amen. I'd like to say it's good to be here this morning. Good to see everyone out. We're going to continue our study, of course, in the book of Genesis, and hopefully we'll get over into Genesis chapter 24, where Abraham sends his servant back to his homeland in Mesopotamia to get Isaac a wife from amongst his people. But before we get there, we had some more thoughts in Genesis chapter 23 to cover. And last week we kind of touched on verse 1 that of all the women in the Bible that's mentioned, Sarah's age is given. In Genesis chapter 23 and verse 1, it says she was 127 years old when she passed away. So from what we know and can study about the Bible, this is the only woman whose age is given. So God thought a lot about Sarah. Sarah was a very important person in the Bible and in God's plan to bring about the fruition of the children of Israel, and of course to lead to Christ coming on the cross at Calvary there in Jerusalem. So she was a very important character, and we know that she's referred to in the Bible in a couple of places, and one of the places that we talked about is very interesting when we turn over to what Peter had to say. And let me turn there right quick like, and what Peter had to say about Sarah in 1 Peter chapter 3. And we'll start reading in verse, let's just start reading in verse 1, and it'll lead right on up to Sarah. And so we find several thousand or 1,000 years or so later, Sarah mentioned here as being one to be looked upon as a person of faith and dignity. So it's really amazing when you begin to look at how important Sarah is in the Bible. Peter said, likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. If any obey not the word, they also may be without the word won by the conversation of the wives, while they behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose outward adorning let it not be that outward adorning, a plaiting of the hair, the wearing of gold, or the putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, in that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of a great price. For after this manner, in the old times, the holy women, also who trusted in God, adorned themselves, being in subjection to their own husbands. So one of the things we find here, that the holy women of old trusted in God. So that speaks volumes right there. You know, we know the Bible is masculine in gender. Overall, the men have the leadership, but women play a very important role in this. And so there's things to be learned from the manner of life of these women and how they lived and conducted themselves and how they adorned themselves. And so we find that in verse 6 is what we want to key in on. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. So he's referring back here to women that follow after these practices here that he lists are the daughters of Sarah as long as you do those things. You know, we all know that we are the children of Abraham, okay? But when you narrow it down, look at Sarah, that the women are the daughters of Sarah also that do these things. As a matter of fact, Peter takes us to a next level that's very often overlooked, and it's something to think about. In verse 7, and he directs this toward the husbands. Likewise, ye husbands, do well with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel, and being heirs together of the grace of life, that your prayers be not hindered. So he tells the husbands they're to give due respect and due honor to the wife. And we know that's taught throughout the Bible. What's interesting when you go back and look at this, you'll find that the Bible really was a great, if you will, for the term liberator of women. Because if you look at the cultural standings at this time in the Old Bible and even over into the New Testament, and even in that culture today, we find that women are treated as second-class citizens. Nowhere in the Bible are women to be treated as second-class citizens. Matter of fact, notice what it says here, that if you do these things, husband, you give honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel. This, when that relationship is right, makes you heirs to the grace of life. Now, I want you to think about that. And this is all back in reference and leading back to Sarah and Abraham. They were able to inherit the grace of life. In other words, they had a good life. They had a productive life serving God is what he's getting at here. And they had a good life in other ways. You know, we find that Abraham, and we talk about these shadows, and we talked about that last week, and I don't want to get off into that too much because that's a study within itself. But when you look at the wealth of Abraham and the wealth of Abraham's blessings, is that not a shadow of the treasures that Christians have today in the spiritual blessings in Christ Jesus? Are not the spiritual blessings we have in Christ Jesus an overabundance of spiritual treasure? Abraham was the physical. He had the physical treasures, didn't he? But we can see today that as Christians, we, like Abraham, have an abundance of treasures today. And so we find that it's really interesting about when you begin to look at the life of Sarah, and you'll find one or two other places where she's mentioned, but we won't turn there because we did last week. But I thought I'd just use that one as a reference point to start the lesson today. And so we find that Sarah now has passed away at a great old age. One of the things that we're going to pick up on now, we're going to find that Abraham is going to want a place to bury Sarah. And what we're going to find about this place of burial, a lot of the great patriarchs, if you will, of the Bible are buried over there around Mamre, which we said is over in the region of what's called Hebron. So it's over in that region where this cave is located at. To my knowledge, and we used to get a biblical archaeological paper, a booklet periodically, which I don't get it anymore, where they would do a lot of diggings over there, and it talked about some of the things they found. One of the things I hadn't seen referenced, and it could be out there somewhere, don't know that in any of their diggings they've actually ever located where this is at. So, but we do know, based on what the Bible tells us here in the land of Canaan, over around Mamre, which is in the area of Hebron, is where this is going to take place. So that's kind of the background history of this. And so it says that, and as we read last week, that Sarah died, and the same as Hebron in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn for Sarah, and he wept for her. So we can see the close attachment that Abraham had to Sarah. So, you know, for one to mourn and to be sad over one that passed away is not unusual, you know. And so it's just something about humans and having that close association of that happening, and that's not uncommon. Abraham, the great man of faith that he became, and we talked last week about how his faith came through fruition and to its fullness when he was willing to sacrifice Isaac. He even had those close associations. And there's a very touching verse that I want to jump over in 24 that we're going to read about Rebekah and Isaac once she becomes his wife. And don't know if you've ever noticed it, but husbands and wives can comfort each other at these times. And when you turn over here, notice what it says in verse 67 of chapter 24. And this is after, Isaac and Rebekah, and we'll get into that, hopefully, maybe start today or maybe next week. And it says about Rebekah that Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So, that says volumes there about Rebekah. That says volumes there about the women in the Bible. So there's a lot of things here that we can learn from these people that maybe we don't necessarily pick up on in a casual reading of it. And I think we've already seen that already. That these things were written for our learning, as Paul told the church at Rome and the church at Corinth, so we can learn from these examples that we have. So we can learn from them. And so we're going to get into verse 3. Reed Griffith, would you pull up Genesis chapter 23 and read verses 3 and 4, please?
Then Abraham arose from the morning before his death and spoke to the sons of Heth, saying, I am a stranger and a foreign resident among you. Give me a burial site among you, so that I may bury my dead out of my sight.
Okay, so we find that now, after Abraham had his period of mourning, he realized that he had a duty and responsibility to bury Sarah. And so it says he stood up before his dead and spake to the sons of Heth, saying, and the sons of Heth, we're going to find that these people are tied into the Hittites. And when you trace this lineage back, the land of Canaan, and you go back, Canaan was the son of Ham. And so we find that these people are descendants of Ham. So these are Ham's people. And one of the things that you're going to notice about this, as it unfolds, God begins to lay down a principle in his word about intermarrying with the people around about you. Okay, so that's one of the things we're going to learn about this. And that theme is carried over throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament, because what God set in order was one man and one woman. And yet he even tightens, if you will, or even wants to restrict that even to God's people. There's a pattern and plan that he wants. And so we find that we're going to learn about that. So these sons of Heth are the descendants of what we call the Hittite Empire. And if you go back historically and look at the Hittite Empire, we're operating what looks like on the outer fringes of it. That it seems like the seat of it was rooted probably in the central Turkey, what we call Turkey today. So that's who these people are. And so Abraham, he makes mention, and this is not the first time that this is used. Abraham said, I'm a stranger. He says, I'm a stranger and a sojourner with you. What's he talking about there? Was he a stranger? And did he wander in the land of Canaan physically? Yes. Was he a foreigner, if you will, or an alien to that land, if you will? Yes, he was. But does he mean something deeper here than just being a sojourner and wanderer in the land? Let's turn over here and look and see in Hebrews chapter 11 if that statement actually gives us a better picture of what Abraham is talking about. Now, I'm going to back up just a second because it does mention Sarah here, okay? I want to back up to Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 11. Through faith also Sarah herself conceived strength to conceive seed and was delivered of a child when she was past age, and she judged him faithful who had promised her. Who did she judge faithful? Who did she look unto for that? Well, she looked unto God, didn't she? She looked unto God. And so we find that she's involved here like Rahab the harlot and others in the Hall of Fame of faith. And notice what it says here about those that died in faith. And it's going to particularly key in on Abraham in just a minute. I want to back up to verse 8 and get a little ahead of myself. By faith, Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place he should after receive for inheritance, obeyed, and he went out not knowing whither he was going. And so we use that verse a lot of times to denote when God wants us to go out into the world and preach the gospel. Well, Abraham went out into a place that was unknown to him, really, as far as wandering in it. And so he went. And notice what it says here. By faith, he sojourned, he wandered in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs to him of the same promise. Now here we go. What about that stranger and pilgrim and sojourning and wanderer statement he makes over here? That's what it says here. I done lost my place now. Oh, it says, these all died, verse 13, in faith, and having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For they said that they declare plainly that they seek a country, but now they desire a better country, that is a heavenly country. And that's what Abraham was seeking for. I think we touched on it last week about that being used a couple of times. David even owned up to that, about that he was a stranger and pilgrim upon this earth. And there were others that used that statement. So we find, yes, is it true that Abraham was a alien, that he was a foreigner in the land of Canaan and he sojourned in it? Mm-hmm. Sure. But also, is there a deeper meaning here to that? That he realized that these things that he was seeing and where he wandered at was temporal in nature, that he looked for a heavenly home and not one here upon this earth. And so he tells the sons of Heth, I'm a stranger and sojourner. And he says, give me a possession of a burying place with you, that I may bury my dead and out of sight. And, one of the things here when Abraham says, give this, in their custom, this was a way of starting to bargain or barter. Really what Abraham is saying here, I need a place to bury my wife, and I would like to have this cave over here. Okay, that's what he's saying. Now, in some of the cultures over there, as you get deeper into them, they will actually use that statement, give me this place. That's their way of opening up a dialogue to purchase something. Okay, because you're going to see that as this conversation unfolds here, that the sons of Heth are going to say, okay, I'll just give it to you, you go bury your wife. Okay, that is laid out to the point to where you have to look at it from these Hittite standpoint of view. Abraham being a great wealthy sheik like he was, and we see already that he has a great name amongst these people, they may have been looking at it more from a business proposition. Might not be a bad idea with this rich man if we get in good with him. So you have to look at it from that standpoint too, because you're dealing with these heathen people and their culture. Okay? So anyway, Abraham wants a place to bury Sarah, so he opens a dialogue up with these people that he may bury the dead. Verses 5 and 6. Eric, do you have that?
And the children of Heth answered Abraham, saying unto him, Hear us, my Lord, thou art a mighty prince among us, and the choice of our sepulchres bury thy dead. None of us shall withhold from thee his sepulchre, but that thou mayest bury thy dead.
Yeah, so we find this respect being showed to Abraham, and notice what this response brings into it. Thou art a mighty prince among us. So they recognized Abraham as being a mighty man. So this may have been in their minds, not in Abraham's mind, more of a way of getting in good with Abraham, so to speak. You can see all this wealth and things. Might not be a bad idea if we just let him have a cave over here and bury his dead. But also we find too that a lot of times that is used to open up a dialect. It's kind of like what, as I said earlier, that we would say, hey, I'm interested in that over there. I'd like to obtain that. And maybe every once in a while, I haven't run into it. You may have run into it, but maybe every once in a while people say, oh, you can just have that over there. And we'll go, no, I'm gonna buy it. I don't want no strings attached, so to speak. And so this is kind of like what we're saying here, okay?
The ESV says, you are the Prince of God among us.
Yeah, they reckon.
Recognized that he
Yeah, they recognized him, didn't they? That who he was different, what did you? Sure was, Prince of God. They realized that. Even though they're heathen people, they knew there was something different going on in the life of Abraham. They sure did. They recognized him being an honorable man. Is what they did. It's very good. And so we find that they recognized this, and they said, well, hey, you can have our choice sacrifice. You can have our choice bearing sign. And so we find that Abraham then stood up, and he bowed himself to the people of the land, even to the children of Heth, and he communed with them, saying, if it be your mind that I should bury my dead out of my sight, hear me, and entreat me to Ephron, the son of Zohar. So the son of Zohar seems like where he really wants to bury his dead, where that cave is at. And so he tells him he wants to get a dialogue started with this Zohar. And so we find, as we look at this in verse 8, he said that he may give me the cave of Machpelah, which he hath, which is at the end of his field, for as much money as is worth he shall give it to me, for a possession of a burying place for you. So now you begin to see the full picture about, for this money he will give it to me. This is what the whole thing is leading up to, is the purchase of this cave. Abraham was willing to pay for that cave. One of the things that you're going to see here with Abraham is a great lesson too about our dealings with people, especially as members of the church and people of the world, that we should have honorable dealings with people to have that good name intact. Yeah, our good name, but also the good name of the church. I can remember hearing stories from some of the older gospel preachers about in the 50s and 60s, a lot of times radio stations and television stations wouldn't issue a credit line to churches because there were so many of them out there that would go in, they would get on the radio and television, and then they wouldn't pay the bill. But pretty much amongst the churches of Christ, you could walk to a radio station or a television station in the 50s and 60s and say you want 30 minutes of broadcast time. No issue. That's the reputation it had. It also had the reputation of preaching the gospel, didn't it? Then, okay? But it had an honorable reputation amongst the sons and daughters of men. It's just really interesting when you go back and look at it. At the honorability, even though the church was not looked in favor in general, but they knew the people that were in the church, the world did, were honorable people. And if you notice it today a lot of times, the reason that when things come up and some members of the church make the mass media, they'll talk about it and say something about it, but you notice I don't dwell on it too much. The reason being in times past, because of the preachers and men of the congregation would call these radio stations and even go down there and they'd have a word-to-word conversation with them. So that's kind of been in the media. The church has kind of been in times past hands off. We're just not going, we're going to get the gospel preached at us if we go fooling with them people. And that's what it has been in times past. But I know that's changing because the church has evolved into the world, really. Not us here, but I'm saying in general, a lot of congregations are no more than community churches, really. It's what they are. And so we know that's changing somewhat. But traditionally, you haven't heard much negative press, even though things go on in the church and people in the church conduct certain activities. You don't hear a lot of dwelling on it in the press. And that's why, because of the preaching of the gospel. It was generally held as a hands-off type thing. You just don't, because we're going to get eaten alive if we fool with them folks too much. Which is a good thing, in a lot of ways. That just shows you the impact that the gospel had of its preaching in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Brother Con, you probably may know something about all that. I mean, pretty much anything said about the church, these people, they got the gospel preached to them, didn't they? So, that's how it was handled. Anyway, so we can see that Abraham's dealings with these people are honorable, and so it shows a lot of respect that these people of the world had to Abraham. And so Abraham wants to buy this cave, has a burying place. Verses 10, 11, and 12. Jeff, do you have that?
Now Ephraim was sitting among the Hittites. Ephraim the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, of all who went in at the gate of the city, no, my Lord, hear me, I will give you the field. I will give you the cave that is in it. In the sight of the sons of my people, I give it to you. Bury your dead. And then Abraham bowed down to him and the people of the land, and said to Ephraim, in the hearing of the people of the land, but if you will, hear me, I give the price of the field, accept it from me, that I may bury the dead. And Ephraim answered Abraham, my Lord, listen to me, a piece of land worth 400 shekels of silver. What is that between you and me? Bury your dead.
Yeah. So we can see now what this give and purchasing and bartering is done. So Abraham did barter with, if you will, for this land. But one of the things that you're going to see about Abraham, he didn't do a lot of dickering, did he? They set a price on it, they agreed to the price, and Abraham paid that price. So that says volumes about Abraham. And we know that it would have been customary in that culture for Abraham to say, no, I can't give you that much silver, and I'll give you this much silver. And they could have went back and forth and all like that. And we see haggling done over there today. And we do that somewhat here still, especially when we go to purchase a product of any value. We try to haggle a little bit. You go buy a car, you go buy, even sometimes you go to Lowe's, and what you're doing is, well, don't you have something on sale, or don't you have something? We're kind of haggling around with it. So that's not uncommon. We do that today. So this was all about him purchasing this field. And Abraham said, I will give thee money for the field. Take it of me, and I'll bury my dead there. And what this is doing with Abraham, really, is pulling these children of Canaan, these Hittites, out of the picture. If he buys it, it's his. They got no say-so. Now, you know, when somebody gives you something, you feel obligated, don't you? Well, Abraham didn't see where he needed to be obligated to these people, even if they were willing to give it to him. Kind of believe the way this reads, they wouldn't have been willing, but it seems like it takes on the atmosphere more of a business deal to them. Hey, we give Abraham a place to bury the dead. Boy, look at all that wealth and cattle and sheep he's got over there. At some point in time, we made to go, hey, Abraham, I need a couple hundred head of sheep. What you going to say? I mean, you can say no, but that's going to probably create a war, right, Daniel? So you kind of feel obligated. So Abraham didn't feel obligated to the world, if you will. And so as we look at these stories, and a lot of times that's how we read these narratives, we don't think about that these things were not written to take up space. As the New Testament says, they were written for our learning so we can learn business dealings from what we see over here. We can learn good business dealings and we can learn bad business dealings, but with Abraham we see that this has created a lot of honor in Abraham. And so Abraham was willing to pay him good money, 400 shekels of silver, and he says, you know, what is that betwixt us and thee? Bury therefore thy dead. And so we find that when Ephraim answered that, he says, okay, 400 shekels of silver, what's that between us? I'm good with it. You know, we're not going to let that stand in the way of whatever. Brother Con, you seem like you got something you want to say.
Yeah, is everything okay?
Okay.
You see, well, I will say one thing, that all the way from the very beginning, Abraham didn't intend not to pay for it. He wasn't going to have it no other way.
Right.
In
Right.
other words, his mind was sick.
Right. Right.
Whatever they value it to be, that's what I'm going to pay them.
Right.
Because
Right.
if I get what I want, then I don't mind paying for it.
Exactly.
That was what it was.
Yeah, exactly. When you look at this, we know who Adam Clarke is. He wrote a great commentary, and yet we know that when you read his commentary, he calls the church and things of that nature, but never was a member of it. And so, it's like a lot of commentaries and learned men. It makes you wonder how they miss the whole point, and they talk about it, right? But Adam Clarke said it like this: they who, under the sanction of religion, trample underfoot the decent forms of civil respect, supposing that because they are religious, that they have a right to be rude, totally mistake the spirit of Christianity. So I think what Adam Clarke said and what we were talking about earlier, about a lot of times people use religion as a guise to obtain things that they shouldn't. It's rude, and it's totally mistaken the spirit of Christianity. We talked a little bit about what went on in the 50s and 60s with a lot of religious bodies and leaving the radio stations and TVs holding the bag and wouldn't pay the bills, and yet the church could go to most any radio station. Now I will qualify that because most of us know what happened with WBAM in Montgomery and Brother Porterfield, but he preached the gospel, and of course them denominations finally had enough of it and they had him banned for a while. But that had nothing to do with the paying of the bills. And so that speaks volumes about him, okay? And wish he was still around today. I used to love to hear him speak, Brother Con. Brother Porterfield, OB.
Porterfield, he went down hard on the denomination.
Yep.
He just tell you flat and plain that out that they wasn't no part of the church.
Right.
And he was trying to keep the church on a separate basis.
Right.
But I'm going to tell you how the world fell around them, and what they gained from that was a thought that, and they didn't mind using it against the church. I've heard it all my life. After I became a member of the Church of Christ, I kept on hearing over and over, that's the people that don't believe nobody's going to heaven but them.
Yeah.
They're the only ones going to heaven. Well, in the sense of the word, a real preacher could defend that part of it as being a part of preaching the gospel.
Yeah.
And that's what went along with preaching the
Gospel, yeah.
It didn't say that, and I wouldn't say it outright to myself, and I'm telling you that they are the only ones going to heaven, but the only one going to heaven is the one that does the Father's will. And if you do the Father's will, according to the Bible and according to the book of James, when it said, be not hearers but doers only, if you're a hearer only and you hear it and believe it, but you won't do it, then you're deceiving your own self, which ain't no deception as bad as self-deception.
That's correct.
Being deceiving your own self is the worst way you could ever be deceived. Somebody else might deceive you, but it ain't quite as bad as when you deceive your own self. But I'm just going to say that because I've heard it. You may not have heard none of this, but I did this year. That Church of Christ, that's the one on the other side of the railroad track.
Yeah,
They're not up in the city with the rest of the people. They're off over there on the other side of the railroad track.
Yeah. I'd never be putting it mildly. So, good comment. And you think about deception, and we'll touch on that for just a minute, and you can't help to think about being self-deceived. That's probably the worst deception there is, okay? Because if somebody else deceives you, you find out about it, you can do something about that, and you will pretty quick.
Yeah.
But self-deception,
That's bad.
because you can't do nothing about it because you don't realize you've deceived your own self a lot of times, And that's what Timothy said here in 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 12. He's talking about the persecutions that they had suffered at Antioch and Iconium and Lystra and by how the Lord had delivered them. But notice what he says here. But evil men and seducers shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. So what he's really getting at here is, false teachers, false preachers, false religions, they have a tendency to be deceived and continue being deceived, and they wax worse and worse, don't they? They don't turn around. They don't see the error of their way. They just keep adding to it. So that is a very, very interesting thought. And so Abraham, he hearkened in verse 16, and I'm going to finish reading this out because I think we're going to get through with this chapter, so that's good. And just like chapter 24, don't know how much we can really glean out of it. We're probably going to go through it pretty quick. But there are some things that we can glean out of it. And Abraham hearkened unto Ephron, and Abraham weighed to Ephron the silver which he had named in the audience of the sons of Heth, 400 shekels of silver, current money with the merchants. And so we find that the field of Ephron, which was in Machpelah, which was before Mamre, the field and the cave, which was therein, and all the trees in the field, and all around about, the borders round about were made sure. So they made a contractual agreement. Abraham's on this. It sounds like what we're getting at here today is they surveyed it. This is yours. Here it is. And that's what we would do today. So this is what they're doing. They're getting into a legal contractual agreement. And after this, Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah before Mamre. The same is Hebron in the land of Canaan. Remember, we talked about this being in the region of Hebron. So this is where we're operating at in that area of Hebron. And the cave, the field and the cave were made sure unto Abraham for a possession of a burying place by the sons of Heth. So they worked out this business deal, and you can see it all worked out for Abraham. These people, even though they were heathen in nature, they were setting up false gods, and this is what we're going to see in chapter 24. The reason that Abraham wanted a wife for Isaac from his own people was because the Canaanites, they were digressing and getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So let me ring this and we'll finish up. Now, when we look at this a burial place over here, not only was Sarah buried there, but we find in Genesis chapter 25 and verse 9, this is also the burial place of Isaac and Ishmael and Abraham. So over here you got these great patriarchs and great men of the Bible that God dealt with one-on-one and made great nations buried in this place. We find in Genesis chapter 49 and verse 31 that Isaac and Rebekah both were buried here. And so we find that Jacob and Leah were also buried there. Joseph buried Jacob there in Genesis chapter 50 and 13. So, we find that this place is rich in Bible history over here. Just the burial place itself. So, in a sense, I guess you will, if you want to look at it from a physical standpoint of view, did they inherit the land of Canaan? Yeah. They're buried there in that land. In a spiritual sense. Later on, they would inherit it in a physical sense, wouldn't they? And so we can learn that lesson there too. So that area was thought of, and Abraham had instilled into his family enough of the promise that they didn't want to leave either. Joseph, when they went down into Egypt, what request did he make? When you leave Egypt, I want to leave too. You know what Joseph was saying? I don't want to stay in this place of sin. I don't want my bones in this place of sin. I want to be buried here in the land of promise. So it's a lot of powerful lessons here in all this. And of course, we're going to move into chapter 24, and we'll just kind of touch on that kind of briefly. This is where Abraham in his old age, and he's well stricken, it says in verse 1, talks to his elder servant here. And he's going to send his elder servant back to his people. One of the things that we're going to learn next week about this is the elder servant here, or the ranking servant, if you will, said, well, if I go up there, what if she won't come back? Well, you're no longer obligated by the bond. But he also tells the servant, because the servant wants to actually take Isaac with him up there. And Abraham says, no, you can't take Isaac up there. You're not going to let him go up there. You see, what Abraham could see is that if he let Isaac go up there back into Mesopotamia, back up into Iraq in our day, he might want to stay. You know, he don't want Isaac looking back, does he? Can you see a shadow of what's coming in the New Testament about looking back and going where God hadn't directed you to going? So there's a whole lot in here that we're going to learn from that. Maybe not as much as what we've learned from times past in some of the narratives, but there's a whole lot in here. And we're going to see too here about the providence of God, and that is God providing a way for those that are obedient. So God's going to provide this way for Isaac to have a wife. And, you know, Abraham was pretty blunt about this thing. I do not want him marrying them Canaanites. If she won't come back from my people, from my stock, and marry my son, it's better that he remain unmarried. You see a theme in that somewhere? You know, when you challenge your thought process in these things and you look at them, you have to ask yourself a question. When did God's mind really change on a lot of subjects? What we're seeing here is the implementation of the subject matter. Genesis, the beginning. What we're seeing here is the implementation of these things that we know about today in the New Testament. What's all this leading to anyway? The New Testament, isn't it? That's why it's written for our learning. You can take this Old Testament and you can plot a pathway that leads right to Jesus Christ and the cross. Straight shot. No deviation. That's why we have these things for our learning. And I'll stop right there and we'll pick up next week, as well as we'll talk about in Deuteronomy and 1 Kings and 2 Corinthians. We find that thought is still carried over throughout the Bible about marrying within one's own people. So anyway, we'll stop right there and I'll ring the bell.